It all started so innocently. What began as a way to unwind after long workdays quickly became something darker. I told myself it was just a harmless way to cope, a little indulgence to help me forget the stress and frustrations that seemed to choke me daily. But soon, I was no longer in control. The substances ruled me, whispering in my ear every time I tried to focus, rest, or even breathe. To the world, I remained the same old me, polished, composed, responsible. Friends complimented me on my ability to keep it all together, to smile, even when things were falling apart. They never suspected that behind closed doors, I was a slave to my own cravings. But hiding the truth became an art. I learned to clean up, to cover the traces of my addiction with precision. Fresh clothes, minty breath, rehearsed excuses, all of it woven into a carefully maintained illusion of perfection. The shame clung to me like a second skin, and the more I tried to tear it away, the deeper it sank in. I knew I was spiraling, but admitting it would mean acknowledging the darkness that had taken root within me. And so I continued to hide, even as the walls of my fabricated world began to crack. Lying became second nature. The worst part was how easy it was to manipulate those who cared about me. Friends would invite me out, and I'd always decline with some vague excuse about work or being too tired. I built a fortress of deception around me, reinforced by half-truths and fabricated stories. The more I lied, the deeper I sank into the addiction. Every time I made it through a day without my facade cracking, I rewarded myself with more of the poison that was slowly killing me. But the guilt wouldn't let me rest. I started avoiding my friends, ignoring their calls, and finding reasons to be alone. Isolation became my comfort zone because, in solitude, I didn't have to pretend. I could be myself, a broken, addicted man spiraling out of control. Yet even in my darkest moments, I refused to admit that I had a problem. I kept telling myself that I could stop whenever I wanted. The truth, however, was something I was too terrified to face. The cracks in my carefully constructed facade began to show. At work, I missed deadlines, fumbled through meetings, and snapped at colleagues for the smallest inconveniences. My reputation, once polished and respected, was now stained by careless mistakes and erratic behavior. But instead of confronting the problem, I leaned even further into my addiction, using it to numb the panic and shame that kept clawing at my insides. Family gatherings became torture. The worried looks, the concerned questions, the subtle hints that something was off. I hated them for noticing, for trying to help when I wasn't ready to admit I needed it. So I shut them out too. It was easier to keep everyone at arm's length than to face the disappointment in their eyes. I convinced myself I was fine, that this was just a rough patch I'd eventually overcome. But deep down I knew I was lying to everyone, especially myself. The day I hit rock bottom was a blur of desperation and self-loathing. I'd gone too far, taken too much, and ended up collapsing in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my addiction. I remember waking up to the sickening realization that I could have died, that I should have died. And yet, even then, the urge to drown myself in oblivion was stronger than ever. I stared at my reflection, seeing the hollowed-out version of myself that I had become. The man in the mirror was a stranger, one I despised but couldn't break free from. The fear of being exposed, of having my secret laid bare before everyone I cared about, was paralyzing. So I continued to hide, to pretend, to lie. I wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet. I should have seen it coming. The people who cared about me weren't stupid. They had noticed the changes, the decline, the secrecy. They gathered one evening, their faces tense with worry and determination. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Every lie I had told, every moment of weakness, thrown back at me with painful accuracy. It wasn't an attack. It was a desperate plea to help me break free from the darkness I had embraced. Their words were raw, filled with anger, hurt, and love. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to storm out and leave them behind, something in me broke. For the first time, I admitted that I was lost, and admitting it felt like ripping open a wound that had been festering for far too long. Recovery was nothing like I imagined. It was brutal, messy, and filled with failures that nearly crushed me. Every day was a battle against cravings, against the urge to slip back into the comforting haze of addiction. Therapy sessions tore open old wounds, forcing me to confront the pain I had tried so hard to bury. But for the first time, I was facing the truth head-on. I had to rebuild myself from the ground up, piece by painful piece. And as I slowly began to heal, I realized something that shocked me. I wanted to live, not just exist, but truly live. The fog was lifting, and with it, the shame and guilt that had once consumed me. Recovery wasn't just about quitting the addiction. It was about rebuilding everything I had shattered along the way. The hardest part was facing the people I had hurt. Friends who had been pushed away, family members who had been left wondering where they went wrong. Their trust wasn't something I could simply earn back with a few apologies. It required consistency, patience, and honesty. I reached out to each of them, confessing my mistakes and my journey toward healing. Some were forgiving, their relief overshadowing the resentment they once held. Others were more cautious, their words laced with bitterness and doubt. But even their skepticism was justified. I had to prove that I was changing, not just through words but through actions. It was an exhausting process, but I couldn't stop. Not if I truly wanted to be free. The journey of recovery forced me to look inward, deeper than I ever had before. My addiction had been a symptom of something much darker: self-loathing, insecurity, fear of failure. Therapy sessions became brutal confrontations with my own demons. I was no longer fighting against the addiction itself, but against everything that had made me seek its comfort in the first place. Days blurred into weeks as I dug through the rubble of my own psyche, uncovering wounds I hadn't even realized existed. And while the process was agonizing, it was also liberating. For the first time, I was learning who I truly was. Not the broken man I had been, but someone capable of healing, of rebuilding, of living without the crutch of addiction. Recovery wasn't a straight line. Temptation crept in like a shadow, whispering promises of relief during the darkest days. There were moments when I nearly gave in, when the struggle felt too overwhelming to bear. The weight of guilt and shame threatened to drag me back down. But each time I faltered, I reminded myself of the people I was fighting for, of the life I wanted to build. I developed coping mechanisms, routines that grounded me when the world felt too heavy. Support groups became my lifeline, a place where my struggles were understood, not judged. As the weeks stretched into months, I found myself growing stronger. The cravings never truly went away, but they became easier to resist. My willpower was being forged in the fires of my own suffering, and I refused to let my past define me. Months later, I looked at my reflection and saw something unfamiliar: hope. The journey wasn't over, I knew that. Recovery would be a lifelong battle, but I was ready to face it. I had rebuilt relationships that I thought were lost forever. My friends and family still had their doubts, but they were willing to walk this path with me. I had finally found a purpose beyond the addiction. Helping others who were going through the same darkness gave me strength. I started sharing my story, not to gain sympathy, but to show that change was possible. That hope could be found even in the deepest abyss. For the first time in years, I felt free, and I was determined to stay that way.